Imagine two people sitting in the same city, breathing the same air, working roughly the same hours, and yet living in completely different realities, not because of luck, not because of intelligence, but because of a number. A number sitting in a bank account, or not sitting there. A number that determines what options exist when the car breaks down, when the rent goes up, when an opportunity appears without warning. Wealth is not simply a measure of comfort. It is a measure of how many choices you have and how much time you have to make them. And when you map out what life actually looks like at each stage of financial reality, a pattern emerges that most people were never taught to see. The first level is what researchers call financial fragility, and it is far more common than the public conversation about money tends to acknowledge. At this stage, a household has little to no liquid savings, often less than a few $100s available at any given moment. The defining characteristic of financial fragility is not poverty in the traditional sense. Many people at this level are employed, sometimes working multiple jobs, sometimes earning wages that appear adequate on paper. What makes this stage distinct is the complete absence of a financial buffer. Every dollar that comes in has already been assigned before it arrives: rent, utilities, food, minimum debt payments, and there is nothing left over to absorb an unexpected event. The Federal Reserve has documented for years that a meaningful percentage of American adults could not cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. $400. That is not a catastrophic sum, and yet for tens of millions of households, it represents a crisis threshold. At this level, financial decisions are not made strategically. They are made reactively, under pressure, often with incomplete information and no room for error. The psychological weight of this stage is distinct and well documented in behavioral economics research. When the mind is consumed by immediate scarcity, cognitive bandwidth for long-term planning is measurably reduced. This is not a character flaw. It is a documented consequence of operating under chronic financial stress. Decision-making becomes short-term by necessity, not by choice. The person who takes out a high-interest payday loan to cover a bill is not making an irrational decision in the context of their situation. They are making the only available decision, and the system is structured in a way that makes that option extremely expensive. Being at this level of wealth is not just uncomfortable, it is mathematically costly in ways that compound over time.
Moving upward, the next meaningful threshold is what might be called financial stability, the point at which a household has covered its basic obligations and has begun to accumulate a small but real cushion. This typically begins somewhere around 1 to 3 months of expenses saved, combined with income that slightly exceeds outgoing costs. The transition from fragility to stability is psychologically significant, even if the dollar amounts involved seem modest. For the first time, a person can absorb a minor emergency without it cascading into a crisis. A car repair does not become a missed rent payment. A medical bill does not trigger a cycle of debt. The decisions available at this level are qualitatively different, not just quantitatively different, because optionality has entered the picture in a small but real way. At this stage, the primary financial challenge shifts from survival to discipline. Income is present, basic stability exists, but the gravitational pull of lifestyle inflation becomes real. As income rises modestly, spending tends to rise in parallel, often faster. This is the mechanism behind what economists call the hedonic treadmill, the tendency for improved circumstances to recalibrate a person's baseline expectations upward, so that what felt like comfort at a lower income begins to feel inadequate at a higher one. The person who once felt relief at a $2,000 monthly paycheck begins within months of earning $3,000 to feel that $3,000 is barely enough. This is not weakness, it is a deeply embedded psychological adaptation, but understanding it as a system rather than a personal failing is what separates those who build from this stage from those who remain perpetually stretched, regardless of what they earn.
The next threshold is often called the middle-class stability zone, and it is where the largest share of working adults in developed economies spend their lives. Household income is sufficient to cover expenses, support a family, maintain a home, and fund a modest retirement contribution. On the surface, this looks like financial success, and in many ways it is. But the hidden tension at this level is the illusion of security created by assets that are not liquid. The home has equity, but it cannot be spent without selling. The retirement account is growing, but it is locked behind a decade or more of waiting. A family at this level may have a net worth of several $100,000 on paper, and yet still be one serious illness, one job loss, or one sustained economic downturn away from significant financial disruption. The liquidity gap, the distance between nominal wealth and accessible wealth, is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in personal finance, and it is most acute precisely at this level, where people feel wealthy enough to stop worrying, but aren't liquid enough to weather a real storm. Above this band, something structural begins to shift. When liquid net worth, meaning accessible, investable assets, not including a primary home, crosses into the range of roughly $100,000 to $250,000, the mathematical relationship between a person and money begins to change in a fundamental way. At this threshold, money begins to generate meaningful passive returns. A portfolio of $150,000 invested conservatively might generate $6,000 to $9,000 per year without any active effort. That is not financial independence, but it is the beginning of a dynamic that compound growth depends on, the point at which money has enough mass to start pulling other money toward it. The decisions available at this level are qualitatively different again, not because the person is wealthier in a lifestyle sense, but because time horizons expand and risk tolerance becomes a genuine choice rather than a forced outcome.
The jump from this level to what is typically described as high net worth, a liquid portfolio above $1 million, is not merely quantitative. It represents a categorical shift in how a person relates to earned income. Below this threshold, earned income is the primary variable that determines financial trajectory. Above it, investment returns begin to compete with earned income as a source of wealth generation, and eventually surpass it. A portfolio of $1.5 million, generating a 6% annual return, produces $90,000 per year in passive growth. That is a full professional salary, accumulating silently while the person sleeps, travels, or works at something they have chosen rather than something they require. This is the mathematical reality behind what is often described as financial freedom. Not that money becomes unlimited, but that the dependency on active labor becomes optional. The final stage most frameworks identify is true financial independence, the point at which passive income reliably covers all living expenses without depleting the underlying capital. Financial planners often model this using the 4% withdrawal rule, derived from historical market return data, which suggests that a portfolio can sustain a 4% annual withdrawal indefinitely with high statistical probability. Under this model, financial independence requires a portfolio of approximately 25 times annual expenses. A person living on $60,000 per year needs $1.5 million. A person living on $100,000 per year needs $2.5 million. These are large numbers, but they are not abstract. They are mathematical targets that can be worked toward incrementally, and the path toward them is governed by mechanics that are entirely learnable. What this map of wealth levels reveals, more than anything else, is that the difference between most of these stages is not income. It is the gap between income and spending, and how consistently that gap is directed toward assets that grow. A person earning $200,000 per year who spends $195,000 is financially fragile in the ways that matter most. A person earning $60,000 per year who consistently saves and invests $12,000 is building genuine structural wealth, slowly but with mathematical certainty. The accumulation of wealth at its core is not a story about talent or inheritance or market timing. It is a story about the sustained management of the gap between what comes in and what goes out, compounded over time.
The most important shift that tends to occur as people move through these levels is not in their bank balance, it is in how they think about money. At the fragility stage, money is a source of anxiety that demands immediate attention. At the stability stage, money is a tool for avoiding crisis. At the middle level, money is a measure of status and security. But at the higher levels, and this is the shift that matters most, money becomes a system to be managed rather than a resource to be consumed. The people who cross in genuine financial independence almost universally describe a reorientation in which the question stops being, "How much can I spend?" and becomes, "How do I ensure this system keeps working?" That is not an emotional transformation, it is a structural one, and it is available to anyone who understands the mechanics well enough to begin building toward it from wherever they currently stand.